The sun had already begun its slow descent behind the trees, casting a warm, golden hue over the empty road. It was the kind of afternoon that felt timeless, as if the world had paused to breathe in the tranquil quiet of the day. Birds chirped lazily from the tree branches, and the sound of leaves rustling in the gentle breeze was a soft lullaby that could soothe any restless soul. The stretch of highway was mostly deserted, save for the occasional car that zoomed by, leaving behind nothing but the faint hum of its engine and a trail of dust in the distance. John had always liked driving at this time of day. The roads were calm, and the fading light seemed to bathe everything in a sense of peace. He was heading home from work, content with how the day had gone, when something caught his eye up ahead. A vehicle was pulled over on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing a rhythmic warning. As he got closer, John could make out the shape of a man standing beside the car, bending over to examine one of the tires. Instinctively, John slowed down. It wasn't unusual to see cars with flat tires on this stretch of highway, but there was something about the man that tugged at him. He seemed older, the way he held himself, as if bending down to inspect the tire took more effort than it should have. John could have kept driving like many would. After all, this wasn't a particularly dangerous situation. The man didn't appear to be in any immediate distress, but something inside him told him to stop. Maybe it was the way his mother had raised him, always emphasizing the importance of helping others when you could, or maybe it was simply the human instinct to lend a hand. John wasn't the type to ignore that instinct. He pulled his car over a few yards in front of the stranded vehicle and got out. As he approached, he called out, "Everything okay here? Need some help with that tire?" The man straightened up slowly, turning to face John. Up close, he looked even older, with silver strands peeking through his short-cropped hair and deep lines etched into his face. His clothes were neat but worn, and there was a weary but grateful expression in his eyes. I think it's just a flat," the man said with a small, tired smile. "I was hoping to get it changed myself, but I guess these old bones don't work as well as they used to." John glanced down at the tire, and sure enough, it was completely deflated. "No problem," he said, already rolling up his sleeves. "I've done this plenty of times. Let's get you back on the road." The older man watched as John made quick work of getting the spare tire from the trunk. "You don't have to do this, you know," the man said. "I can call for a tow, or wait for someone else." John just shook his head with a chuckle. "It's no trouble. I've got a few minutes to spare. Besides, you're out here all alone. Better to get this done now than wait." The older man didn't argue after that. He simply nodded and leaned back against the car, watching as John went to work with practiced ease. They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds being the faint hum of distant cars and the occasional click of John's tools that as John worked. He couldn't help but notice how quiet this stretch of road was. It wasn't that far from town, but it felt remote, like a forgotten path that few traveled unless they absolutely had to. The trees on either side of the road loomed tall, their shadows growing longer as the sun continued to sink lower in the sky. It was peaceful, but there was also a certain stillness that made the air feel heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. After a few minutes, John glanced up at the older man. "You're not from around here, are you?" The man shook his head, a small, wry smile playing at his lips. "No, just passing through. Got a few things to take care of, and I'm on my way to visit some family." John nodded in understanding, though there was something about the man's response that felt a little vague. He didn't press the issue, though. Everyone had their own reasons for being on the road, and not all of them were for sharing. Instead, he focused on finishing the job, tightening the last lug nut, and standing up to stretch. "There we go," John said, wiping his hands on his pants. "That should do it. You're good to go." The older man pushed himself off the car with a groan, clearly feeling the strain of standing still for so long. He looked down at the tire, then back at John with a look of genuine gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "You didn't have to stop, but you did. That means a lot." John waved it off with a smile. "No need to thank me. Just glad I could help." But the older man wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. "At least let me give you something for your trouble," he said, thumbing through a few bills. John held up his hands, shaking his head. No, that's not necessary." I didn't do this for money. Just wanted to make sure you were okay." The man hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to respond to such kindness. Then he nodded, tucking the wallet back into his pocket. "You're a good man," he said quietly. "Not many people like you out there these days." John wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he just smiled and nodded. "Well, take care," he said, stepping back towards his car. "Safe travels." The older man nodded, watching as John got into his vehicle and started the engine. As John pulled back onto the road, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the man still standing there, watching him drive away. There was something almost haunting about the way the man stood, as if he were rooted to the spot, watching until John disappeared from sight. The encounter stayed with John as he drove the rest of the way home. It wasn't unusual for him to help someone in need, but there was something about that man, something in the way he'd looked at John, that felt different. It was as if the man had been expecting him, as if their paths had been meant to cross at that exact moment. The thought sent a small shiver down John's spine. Though he couldn't quite explain why by the time he reached his house, the sun had nearly set, casting the sky in hues of pink and orange. He parked his car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, thinking about the man with the flat tire. There was something strange about it all, but John couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. It had been a simple act of kindness, nothing more. And yet, the look in the man's eyes, the way he'd thanked John, felt like there was more to the story than he knew. John shook off the feeling and climbed out of the car, heading inside to settle in for the evening. The warmth of his home greeted him, the familiar smell of dinner wafting from the kitchen. But even as he sat down to eat, the image of that old man lingered in the back of his mind, like a puzzle that he couldn't quite solve. Little did John know that simple act of kindness would lead to something far more extraordinary than he could have ever imagined. But for now, it was just another quiet evening, with the memory of a stranger on the side of the road lingering in the fading light. The rhythmic sound of metal clicking against metal echoed through the air as John worked on the flat tire. His hands moved with practiced ease, despite the slight tension he felt in his muscles from bending down at an awkward angle. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the road, and the distant sound of crickets beginning to chirp added to the growing sense of twilight. As he focused on loosening the lug nuts, he couldn't help but glance up at the older man every so often. There was something about him, something in the way he stood, slightly hunched but with a quiet dignity, that made John feel like he was in the presence of someone with a story. The older man hadn't said much after John had insisted on helping. He mostly stood off to the side, his weathered hands resting on his hips, his eyes scanning the empty road as though he was searching for something or someone. John couldn't shake the feeling that the man's silence wasn't just gratitude, but maybe also a form of contemplation. It was like he was seeing beyond the act itself, thinking of something that had yet to be revealed. "Used to change these things a lot faster when I was younger," the man finally said, his voice soft, as if he was speaking more to himself than to John. There was a slight chuckle that followed, but it was tinged with the kind of tiredness that comes with age, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. John grinned as he twisted off the last lug nut, the spare tire leaning against his leg. "Yeah, I bet you did. It's not a bad thing to slow down, though. Gives you time to appreciate the little things." The older man nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "Funny thing about time," he said after a moment. "You don't realize how much of it you've used up until one day you wake up and realize there's more behind you than ahead." John paused, letting those words settle in the air. He wasn't sure how to respond to something like that, so he didn't try. Instead, he focused on getting the spare tire into place, tightening the bolts with care, but his mind couldn't help but linger on the man's words. There was a depth in them, a truth that John felt but wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. He was still young, still moving forward, and the idea of running out of time was something he didn't want to dwell on. Yet here was this stranger, reflecting on it in such a calm, almost resigned manner. It made John wonder what kind of life the man had led, what kind of memories he was carrying with him as he stood there, watching the world go by. "You from around here?" John asked, trying to fill the silence with something lighter, something that might pull the man out of whatever deep thoughts were clouding his mind. The man shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "No, Just passing through. Been doing a lot of that lately, passing through. There it was again, that sense of something unsaid, something hidden behind the words. John could feel it, like a shadow hanging over the conversation, but he didn't push. He wasn't the type to pry into other people's business, especially not someone he had just met. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter on the side of the road. There was something more going on here. Something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he finished tightening the bolts, John stood up and stretched, his back cracking as he straightened. He wiped his hands on his pants, smearing a bit of grease across the fabric, but he didn't care. The job was done, and that was what mattered. All set, he said, stepping back to admire his work. You should be good to go. The older man walked over to inspect the tire, nodding in approval. You did good, son, he said, clapping a hand on John's shoulder. I appreciate it more than you know. John smiled, but there was a part of him that felt like there was more to the man's gratitude than just the flat tire. There was something in the way he said it, something in the way he looked at John, like he was seeing more than just a helpful stranger. It was as if the man had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to come along and offer a hand, not just to fix the tire, but to fix something deeper, something unseen. The older man hesitated for a moment, then turned to lean against the hood of his car, crossing his arms over his chest. He seemed lost in thought for a while, as if deciding whether or not to share something. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost as if he were afraid of being overheard by the empty road. You ever have a moment where you feel like you were meant to be in a certain place at a certain time? He asked, his gaze still fixed on the distance. John furrowed his brow, unsure of where the question was coming from. I guess so, he said slowly, thinking back to times when things seemed to fall into place in ways he couldn't explain. Yes, sometimes. Like when things just line up, I guess. The older man nodded, as if John had just confirmed something he already knew. I've been having a lot of those moments lately. Like every road I take leads me to the same place. Every person I meet is somehow connected to the next. He paused, glancing at John, his eyes sharp despite his age. It's strange, isn't it? How life works. You think you're just living day to day, doing what you need to do to get by, but then one day you realize there's been a pattern all along. You just couldn't see it until now. John didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't sure if the man was talking about fate or coincidence, or maybe something else entirely. But there was a weight to his words, something that made John feel like this conversation was about more than just the tire, more than just a chance meeting on the side of the road. Before John could say anything, the older man pushed off the hood of his car and stood up straight, his expression softening. You're a good man, he said, his voice sincere. Not many people would have stopped to help. Most folks these days are too busy with their own lives to notice when someone else is in need. John shifted uncomfortably under the praise, not sure how to react. It was nothing, he said with a shrug. Just seemed like the right thing to do. The man smiled, but there was something sad in it, something that made John feel like he was missing part of the story. It's never nothing, the man said quietly. Not when someone shows kindness. It may seem small to you, but to someone else, it can mean everything. John opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, silver pocket watch. He held it in his palm for a moment, staring at it as if it held the answers to some unspoken question. Then, without a word, he handed it to John. Here, the man said, his voice thick with emotion. I want you to have this. John blinked in surprise, staring at the watch in the man's hand. I can't take that, he stammered, unsure of what to say. It looks like it means something to you. The older man shook his head. It did once, but now it's time for it to mean something to someone else. John hesitated, but there was something in the man's eyes that made him reach out and take the watch. The metal was cool against his skin, and as he held it, he could feel the weight of its history, the years it had witnessed, the moments it had measured. Thank you, John said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded, a look of peace settling over his features. No, he said softly. Thank you. With that, the older man turned and got into his car, starting the engine with a low rumble. John watched as he pulled back onto the road, the red taillights glowing in the fading light. As the car disappeared around the bend, John stood there for a long time, the pocket watch heavy in his hand, his mind swirling with questions. What had just happened? What was it about that man, that moment, that felt so significant? It was as if the universe had shifted, just for a second, allowing their paths to cross in a way that would never have happened under normal circumstances. John glanced down at the watch again, turning it over in his hand. The intricate designs on the case glinted in the dim light, and as he opened it, the soft ticking of the mechanism filled the silence. Inside, the face of the watch was simple, elegant, but there was something etched into the back that caught John's eye. Not a single word, barely visible, but unmistakable. Gratitude. That John closed the watch and slipped it into his pocket, feeling its weight against his leg. He didn't know what the future held or why this encounter had felt so important, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about a flat tire. This was about something much bigger, something he couldn't yet understand. And somehow, he knew that whatever it wasn't over yet. The following morning greeted John with a crisp, cool air that hung in the autumn breeze. The sun had barely risen, casting soft golden light over the sleepy town as the streets remained quiet, save for the occasional bird fluttering by. It was one of those mornings where everything felt still, like the world was slowly waking up, stretching its limbs after a long night of rest. John, however, had woken up earlier than usual, unable to shake the strange encounter from the day before. The memory of the older man lingered in his thoughts, the way his voice had carried that undercurrent of something unsaid. John's fingers instinctively brushed against his pocket, where the silver pocket watch now rested, a reminder of the peculiar moment that had passed between them. He'd spent part of the night lying awake, turning the watch over in his hands, staring at the word gratitude etched into the back. There was something about it that felt significant, though he couldn't put his finger on why. After a quick breakfast and a shower, John decided to step outside and take a walk. His house, situated on the edge of town, was surrounded by towering oak trees and wide stretches of open land. The air smelled of fresh dew and earth, and as John stepped onto his front porch, he took a deep breath, trying to clear his mind. The world felt strangely at peace, but there was a quiet tension beneath the surface, like the calm before a storm. As he made his way down the driveway, his thoughts drifted back to the moment when he'd stopped to help the man with the flat tire. It had been such a simple gesture, but the more John thought about it, the more he realized how unusual the entire encounter had been. It wasn't just the man's gratitude or the way he had insisted on giving John the pocket watch. It was something deeper, something John couldn't quite put into words. He wandered through the quiet streets, his footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. He passed by familiar houses, their windows still dark in the early morning light, and nodded at the few people he saw out walking their dogs or tending to their gardens. Yet, even in this peaceful setting, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. There was a weight in the air, a sense that the universe was waiting to reveal something just around the corner. As he made his way back home, lost in thought, John heard the faint sound of an engine approaching. He glanced up and saw a sleek black SUV slowly coming down the road, its dark-tinted windows glinting in the morning sun. There was something almost ominous about the way the vehicle moved, smooth, deliberate, as if it had a destination in mind. John watched it for a moment, then shrugged it off, assuming it was just someone passing through the neighborhood. But as he reached the end of his driveway, the SUV slowed down, its tires crunching against the gravel as it pulled to a stop right in front of his house. John froze, his heart skipping a beat as the engine idled. The sun reflected off the windshield, obscuring whoever was inside, and for a long moment, there was only silence. It was as if time itself had paused, the morning light casting long shadows across the road, the world holding its breath in anticipation. That John's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. He wasn't one to be easily rattled, but something about this situation felt off. Who would be visiting him at this hour, and why? The thought of the older man crossed his mind again, though he quickly dismissed it. There was no way this could be connected to the man from yesterday. Was there? Just as John was about to turn and walk inside, the driver's side door of the SUV slowly opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a sharp black suit that seemed out of place in the quiet suburban neighborhood. He was tall, with a strong build and dark sunglasses that hid his eyes, his expression unreadable. He stood there for a moment, surveying the surroundings before finally turning his attention to John. "Mr. John Harris?" the man asked, his voice calm but carrying a certain weight. John blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Yeah, that's me," he replied cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope, extending it toward John. "I was asked to deliver this to you. Consider it a token of appreciation." John stared at the envelope, confusion swirling in his mind. Appreciation? For what? The man remained silent, offering no further explanation. He simply held the envelope out, waiting for John to take it. After a moment of hesitation, John reached out and grabbed it, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cream-colored paper. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it held more than just a letter inside. "Who sent this?" John asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "And why?" The man didn't answer. He simply nodded once, then turned on his heel and walked back to the SUV. John watched as he climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door, the vehicle pulling away without another word. Within seconds, the SUV disappeared down the road, leaving behind only the faint echo of its engine. John stood there, staring at the envelope in his hand, his mind racing with questions. What was going on? Why had this man shown up at his house, delivering an envelope with no explanation? And who was behind it all? The logical part of his brain told him that this was some kind of mistake, that it couldn't possibly be connected to the man from yesterday. But deep down, John knew that this wasn't just a coincidence. With a sigh, he turned and walked back into the house, the envelope still clutched in his hand. The weight of it seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if whatever was inside held answers to questions he hadn't even thought to ask yet. He made his way to the kitchen and sat down at the table, the envelope resting in front of him. For a moment, John just stared at it, his mind swirling with possibilities. He thought about the older man, the way he'd handed John the pocket watch, the way he'd spoken about time and gratitude as if they were more than just words. Had the man somehow orchestrated this? Had John unknowingly stepped into something far bigger than he realized? Finally, unable to take the suspense any longer, John tore open the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper, along with a small, neatly wrapped package. His heart pounded in his chest as he unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. Asterisk John. Asterisk, asterisk, I told you yesterday that acts of kindness are never small. They ripple out in ways you can't always see, connecting people, events, and moments in ways that defy explanation. What you did yesterday was not just an act of goodwill. It was the beginning of something much larger than either of us. Asterisk, asterisk, the watch I gave you is more than just a keepsake. It's a marker of time, but also a symbol of the choices we make and the paths we walk. What you hold now in your hands is the next step on that path. Inside the package is something that will guide you, though it may not be in the way you expect. Trust it, and trust yourself. Asterisk, asterisk, there are people who will try to stop you, to keep you from discovering the truth. The man who delivered this message is one of them, though he does not know the full extent of his role. Be careful, John. You've already taken the first step, but the road ahead will not be easy. Asterisk, asterisk, gratitude. Asterisk, John's hands shook as he finished reading the letter. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the cryptic words. What truth was the letter talking about? What was the watch supposed to guide him toward? And who were these people who would try to stop him? His eyes fell to the small package that had been wrapped with such care. With a sense of trepidation, he slowly unwrapped it, revealing a small, intricately carved wooden box. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the dark wood polished to a shine, with delicate designs etched along the edges. John's fingers trembled as he lifted the lid, revealing what was inside. Nestled within the box was a key, small, silver, and unremarkable at first glance. But as John held it up to the light, he noticed that it wasn't an ordinary key. There were symbols engraved along the shaft, symbols he didn't recognize, but that seemed to hum with a quiet energy. He turned the key over in his hands, feeling the cool metal against his skin. And in that moment, he knew that this was no ordinary object. This was the beginning of something he couldn't yet understand, but he could feel it, deep in his bones, in the very air around him. The letter had warned him that the road ahead would be difficult, that there were forces at play that he couldn't see, but there was no turning back now. John pocketed the key and the letter, his mind buzzing with questions. He stood up, glancing out the window at the now empty street, the memory of the black SUV still fresh in his mind. Whoever had sent that man, whoever was behind all of this, knew more than they were letting on. That he had been drawn into something larger than himself, something that had started with a simple act of kindness on the side of the road. And now, as he stood in his quiet kitchen, holding the key that would unlock whatever mystery lay ahead, John knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. As John stood in the kitchen, the key in his hand seemed to pulse with a quiet, unspoken energy. The silver metal felt cool against his skin, the engraved symbols casting faint, intricate shadows in the early morning light. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of inevitability that made his heart pound in his chest. He knew now that this was more than just a simple act of kindness, more than just helping an old man with a flat tire. He had stumbled into something deeper, something that stretched far beyond the quiet streets of his small town. The key wasn't ordinary. Nothing about it was. The weight of it, both physically and metaphorically, settled into his palm like a secret that had been waiting to be uncovered. But a key was only as powerful as the lock it opened, and John had no idea what this particular key was meant to unlock. The letter he had received offered little explanation, only cryptic words about gratitude and choices, about people who would try to stop him. John sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the key as his mind raced with questions. What door was this key meant to open? And why him? Why had the older man chosen him? Out of all the people who could have driven by that day, there had to be others who would have stopped to help. So why was John the one holding this mysterious object? His fingers traced the strange symbols etched into the metal, the curves and lines foreign and unfamiliar. He had never seen anything like them before, but they seemed ancient, like something pulled from a time long past. As he turned the key over in his hand, he could feel a strange energy radiating from it, like a vibration just beneath the surface. It was subtle but unmistakable, a quiet hum that made his skin tingle and the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. John took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The longer he sat there, the more uneasy he felt, like the walls were closing in around him. He couldn't just sit here and wait for something to happen. If the letter was right, if there really were people trying to stop him, then every second he wasted was a second closer to danger. His gaze drifted to the pocket watch that sat on the table next to the key. The older man had given him this as well, and somehow, John knew it was connected. The watch, with its delicate engraving and the word gratitude etched into its surface, wasn't just a sentimental gift. It was a piece of the puzzle, a clue to whatever lay ahead. John picked up the watch and flipped it open, the quiet ticking of the mechanism filling the silence. The second hand moved in a smooth, continuous motion, its rhythm almost hypnotic. As he stared at the watch face, something strange caught his eye. There, just beneath the minute hand, was a faint mark, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. It was another symbol, almost identical to the ones engraved on the key. His heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a coincidence. The watch and the key were connected, and the mark on the watch was telling him something he hadn't yet understood. Without thinking, John stood up from the table, pocketing both the key and the watch. He wasn't sure where he was going or what he was looking for, but he knew he couldn't stay here. The answers weren't in his kitchen, and the longer he waited, the more distant those answers seemed to become. His instincts told him that there was a reason he had been given these objects, and that reason was out there, waiting for him to find it. John grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, his mind buzzing with uncertainty and anticipation. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air hit him like a splash of water, waking him up, sharpening his senses. The sun had risen higher now, casting a soft, golden light over the neighborhood. The street was still quiet, the only sound the distant hum of traffic from the main road. He glanced up and down the street, half expecting to see the black SUV again, its tinted windows hiding whoever was watching him. But there was nothing. just the peaceful, ordinary quiet of a Saturday morning. Still, John couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. With a determined breath, he started walking, his feet carrying him down the familiar streets of his town. He didn't have a destination in mind, but something inside him told him to keep moving, to follow the invisible thread that had been woven into his life the moment he had stopped to help that stranger. As he walked, his thoughts wandered back to the old man, the way he had spoken, the cryptic words about time and kindness. There had been something almost otherworldly about him, something that made John feel like he had stepped into a story that had been unfolding long before he became a part of it. The man's quiet gratitude had seemed genuine, but there was a weight behind his words that John hadn't understood at the time. Now, with the key in his pocket and the letters still fresh in his mind, he realized that the older man had known more than he let on. He had been waiting for John, waiting for the right moment to pass on whatever burden he had been carrying. To John's feet led him toward the edge of town, where the streets gave way to open fields and winding country roads. The trees here were taller, their branches heavy with the colors of autumn, their leaves fluttering down to the ground like whispers. The further he walked, the quieter the world became, the distant hum of civilization fading away until all that remained was the sound of his footsteps and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. But he wasn't sure where he was going, but something about this path felt right. The key in his pocket seemed to grow warmer the further he walked, as if it was reacting to something unseen. John glanced down at his hand, which had unconsciously moved to rest on the key, his fingers wrapped around it as if drawing strength from its presence. After what felt like hours of walking, John came upon an old, weathered building nestled among the trees. It was small, almost forgotten, with ivy climbing up its stone walls and the roof sagging slightly under the weight of time. There was no sign, no indication of what this place had once been, but John knew, somehow he knew, that this was where he was meant to be. The building felt like it had been waiting for him, just as the old man had. It exuded a quiet, ancient energy, as if it had stood here for centuries, watching the world change around it, waiting for the right person to come along and unlock whatever secrets it held. John approached the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The key in his pocket seemed to pulse with each step, its warmth growing until it was almost too hot to hold. He pulled it out and stared at it for a moment, the engraved symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. There was no turning back now. Whatever lay behind this door, whatever answers or dangers awaited him, he had to face them. With a deep breath, John slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, the mechanism clicking into place with a smoothness that seemed almost unnatural. He hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob, before finally turning it and pushing the door open. The room beyond was dark, lit only by the faint light that filtered in through the cracks in the walls. Dust motes floated in the air, and the smell of old wood and forgotten memories filled his senses. But there, in the center of the room, was a single pedestal, and on it sat an object that caught John's eye immediately. That it was another watch, similar to the one the old man had given him, but larger, more ornate. The metal gleamed in the dim light, and the same intricate designs that adorned his pocket watch were etched into its surface. This was it. This was what the key had led him to. John stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the watch. As soon as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a wave of energy surged through him, a rush of emotions and memories that weren't his own. He gasped, stumbling back as images flashed before his eyes. Images of people he didn't know, places he had never been, moments in time that stretched back centuries. The watch wasn't just a timepiece. It was a conduit, a gateway to something far greater than John had ever imagined. It was connected to the flow of time itself, to the choices and actions of every person who had ever held it. And now, it was connected to him. John closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing as the flood of memories slowed to a trickle. He could feel the weight of the watch in his hand, heavy with the burden of time and the countless lives it had touched. This was why the old man had given him the pocket watch. This was why he had been chosen. He understood now. The watch was more than just an object. It was a responsibility to protect time, to ensure that the choices people made, the acts of kindness they offered, rippled out in ways that shaped the world for the better. The key had unlocked more than just a door. It had unlocked the truth about the interconnectedness of all things, the delicate balance between the past, present, and future. John stood there for a long time, the weight of the watch in his hand, the enormity of his role settling in. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of something much bigger than himself, something that stretched across time and space, connecting lives and choices in ways he could barely comprehend. As he left the building, the sun beginning to set on the horizon, John knew that his life would never be the same. The world around him seemed both larger and smaller at the same time, filled with endless possibilities and the quiet echoes of choices yet to be made. He walked back toward town, the watch ticking softly in his pocket, the key no longer needed but still resting in his hand. The road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges, people who didn't want him to uncover the truth, forces that would try to stop him. But John felt a sense of peace now, a quiet resolve that steadied his steps. The old man had been right. Kindness was never small. It rippled out in ways that defied explanation, connecting people, moments, and choices in ways that transcended time itself. And now, as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, John knew that his journey was only just beginning. The watch ticked on, a reminder that time waits for no one. But John was ready.